This is not my mother's menopause.
This is not my mother's menopause.
This is not my mother's menopause.
Hi, I'm Laura, your host for the series, This Is Not My Mother's Menopause, What You Don't Know About Menopause, Hot Flashes, and Night Sweats. This series is about menopause and how it affects women, especially when symptoms of hot flashes and night sweats start. This is the third of a 6-segment series that focuses on the diagnosis, treatments, and management of menopause. In the previous segment, we heard from healthcare experts and women about racial and ethnic challenges as they relate to menopausal experiences. We'll hear from our healthcare experts and guests about some of the more disruptive menopausal symptoms and how they compare among the BIPOC, AAPI, and Euro-American populations. Before we hear from our experts and guests, let's first take a look at what menopause is.
So what is menopause? A clinical definition of menopause is the natural end of women's menstrual cycles due to a decline in the production of estrogen and progesterone hormones in women. In other words, it's nature's way of ending a woman's monthly menstrual cycle and her ability to get pregnant. You may have heard the terms perimenopause and postmenopause. So what is perimenopause? For most women, perimenopause happens in their 40s. Perimenopause begins several years before menopause. So for many women, this will happen in their 40s, but for some, it can even begin in their 30s. This is the time when ovaries gradually begin to make less estrogen. As estrogen hormones rise and fall, periods grow longer or shorter, and women begin to experience menopause-like symptoms. Menopause naturally occurs in women between the ages of 49 and 52. But the age women experiencing natural menopause can also vary widely from 40 to 58 years old. It also varies by ethnicity. Postmenopause is the time after a woman has been without a menstrual period for 12 months or 1 full year. During this stage, menopausal symptoms typically decrease or stop completely. The symptoms of menopause usually develop in the transition years. The most common symptoms are vasomotor symptoms, or VMS. Of those surveyed, 40% of women report feeling hot or cold. 17% experience night sweats. 16% say that insomnia is a symptom of menopause. 13% of women experience vaginal dryness. Mood disorders affect 12% of women in menopause. And 12% of women also report weight gain during menopause. In all, 85% of postmenopausal women have experienced a symptom in their lifetime. VMS are the most common symptoms associated with menopause, affecting more than 50% of women ages 40 to 64. The most frequently experienced menopausal symptom among whites, Hispanics, and African Americans were VMS. And among Asians, it was decreased sexual interest and increased joint and muscle discomfort. According to studies, Asian women experience the smallest number of symptoms, and African American women experience the largest number of symptoms compared with other ethnic groups. Of those surveyed, 53% of African American women were more likely than white women, 29%, to have experienced VMS. Factors associated with VMS included race, BMI, and dietary intake of fat and calories.
Some groups experience the symptoms associated with menopause even late into the transition. According to one study, the average duration of menopause-related hot flashes and night sweats was 6.5 years in non-Hispanic white women. It was about 9 years in Latina women and about 10 years in African American women. A long-held belief is that women experience increased depression and anxiety during their menopause transition. Researchers continue to evaluate the scientific evidence for this belief and whether VMS, sleep disruption, and other stressful factors contribute to negative moods at midlife. When looking at sexual functioning during menopause and how that part of a woman's life is affected by her race or ethnicity, we turn to a study that showed, when compared to white women, Chinese and Japanese women reported lower importance of sex, desire, masturbation, and arousal. They also experienced more sexual pain. Black women reported greater importance of sex, higher sexual intercourse frequency, but more sexual pain, less arousal, less emotional satisfaction, and less physical pleasure. Sexually active Black women also had a smaller decline in sexual functioning, whereas Japanese women had a larger decline across the menopause transition. Latina women had more complaints of vaginal symptoms like vaginal dryness and painful sex. Vaginal symptoms vary by sub-ethnicity as well. Central American and South American Hispanic women reported having the worst symptoms compared with Caribbean Hispanic women. Researchers are also studying the connection between gastrointestinal issues and menopause and how these relate to race and ethnicity. In a study, postmenopausal women generally reported a greater number of symptoms and more severe symptoms. However, more research is needed to establish the cause. Non-Hispanic and Asian women had significantly fewer symptoms overall, and they had lower total severity than the three other racial or ethnic groups. In contrast, non-Hispanic white women experienced higher severity of symptoms, especially when it came to nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, and a loss of appetite. When looking at Native American women, a study reported that these women had more hot flashes than any other ethnic group in their 30s and 40s prior to menopause, but they were not studied through the entire menopause transition, meaning that Native American women may have the worst menopausal experience of all those studied. To share with us some of the most common symptoms associated with menopause and the facts about VMS is Janet Carpenter. She's a distinguished professor at Indiana University School of Nursing who has been studying menopause for 25 years.
Menopausal symptoms affect perimenopausal and postmenopausal women, and the symptoms can really vary based on women's races, ethnicities. And so when we talk about menopausal symptoms, sometimes what we see in the US, for example, doesn't necessarily relate to other women in other cultures. In the US, we tend to see the biggest symptoms being hot flashes, that sudden rush of heat and sweating that women feel. Sleep disturbances are really common. About 3 out of 4 women will have hot flashes and sleep problems. And then we can also see mood changes with women, and that can be anything from anxiety and depression to more of a irritability or crankiness that women talk about. Those are most common. Some women also talk about joint pains, muscle aches. Women can have changes in migraine patterns at menopause. Some women actually get relief from migraines when they go through menopause, and other women begin to experience migraines at menopause.
Racial and ethnic differences in sleep disturbances and what causes them is pretty substantial. In one sleep study, white women reported the most sleep complaints, and Hispanic women the fewest. US-born Hispanic, Chinese, and Japanese women had more sleep complaints compared to their first-generation immigrant counterparts. And Black women reported that they slept shorter periods and it took longer to fall asleep compared to both white and Chinese women. Janet spoke about the differences in hot flashes and joint aches among women of different races and ethnicities.
Some of the racial and ethnic differences we see is in how women experience symptoms and also what symptoms they experience. So in the Hot Flashes Cool educational exhibit that I created, one of the things that I did is I used flowers on mannequins to show different places in the body that women around the world experience hot flashes. Some of my colleagues who are medical anthropologists have done this research where they've traveled to different countries and talked with women, and they've learned that women in Mexico, for example, feel hot flashes as a sticky sweat on the back of their neck. And women in Bangladesh, who often will wear headscarves, are more likely to report having a hot flash on the top of their head, whereas women in the US and Europe, both African American and Caucasian women, will talk about hot flashes from their mid-chest up through their face. So even in terms of a hot flash, they can be felt differently. And then some cultures will report muscle and joint aches are common in Asian women as a main complaint.
Samantha Lamar is a mother of 9 and is currently going through menopause. Sam shared some of her symptoms, including hot flashes and night sweats, and one particular symptom, an increased sex drive, that is not often discussed among menopausal women.
In the beginning, my first symptom of menopause that I didn't know was a symptom of menopause until I did some research was a surge in my sex drive. I didn't know what was happening, why it was like that, and so I started looking into it and learned that as our bodies change, nature lets us know we're getting to where we're not going to be able to reproduce anymore. So there's we need to hurry and have more babies before you're unable to. So that helped me to understand that change. Another symptom was just my cycle changed. What was normally a 28, 29-day cycle ended up extending longer and longer, so I would be late for my period, probably 6 or 7 weeks late. And that was a big sign and symptom. The next symptom after that in the beginning was the night sweats, waking up wet, and my clothes all wet. The night sweats were more prevalent. That was very common. The hot flashes didn't come until a little bit later, and they were very unpredictable. It wasn't very often, but it was enough that I knew what was happening. They were just very random, and it was there was always seemed to be somebody around when it happened, so they could witness my face getting really red and actual heat coming off of my body. But that's what was happening in the beginning, was just more of those two things, but mostly the night sweats.
Other health issues specific to women, such as decreased levels of estrogen after menopause, have been linked to increased rates of heart disease, hypertension, and obesity. Studies have shown that African American women have disproportionate rates of hypertension that can be further complicated as they transition through menopause. Stress coupled with depression and hypertension in perimenopausal African American women has not been fully explored. Over the past 25 years, our understanding of whether and how menopause could influence women's cardiovascular disease or CVD risk has significantly evolved. Menopause is now listed as a female-specific CVD risk factor, according to the American Heart Association. Our next guest, Joyce Moy, is an Asian American Pacific Islander and a resident of Hawaii. She talks about her own personal experiences with menopausal symptoms. Joyce is 75 years old and is retired. Sadly, Joyce suffered 13 miscarriages early in her reproductive years, likely due to endometriosis, and she has no children. She had an emergency hysterectomy at the age of 36 that caused her to go into early menopause. Joyce's menopausal symptoms began shortly after her hysterectomy. Her healthcare provider put her on synthetic hormones, but she was allergic to them. So she soon began to suffer from hot flashes and night sweats. In addition to those symptoms, Joyce was also suffering from a loss of appetite, nausea, depression, and reduced sex drive. Joyce shared how she began to manage her appetite and her weight, as well as her mental health and cardiovascular health.
We would walk. My husband would walk with me. We would walk every single night after dinner. As for diet, we just try to eat a balanced meal and make sure not to eat too much meat. It made me feel better because I gain weight quite fast. And so doctor told me, just watch what you eat, make sure it's a balanced meal, and get your exercise, which was the walking every night that we did. And that helped. I lost weight due to the fact that I didn't eat. I couldn't eat. In terms of my blood pressure and all that, at that time, I was young. I could care less about all that stuff. I'm suffering from it now because I didn't take care of myself, which I tell all my friends now, their children, to watch their diet and don't be like me and end up like me, because I had a stroke 10 years ago from not taking care of myself. You go through the pity party when I went through menopause, so when I did have an appetite, I would stuff myself and I would eat things I shouldn't be eating, and drinking, which I'm not a drinker. But It made me happy then, but I regretted it afterwards. When I became postmenopausal, my appetite I did not have an appetite. As for energy, it was normal. And as for the sexual, there was none. I didn't want anyone touching me or anything because you're just all clammy and everything. The hot flash came on. It was constant. I don't feel that there was a break at that time, but when it finally subsided, then I became normal. I accepted everything, so I felt better after that.
Though women may experience similar menopausal symptoms, their race and ethnicity contributes to what symptoms, how severe, and how long they experience these symptoms throughout their menopause transition. Our next guest, Edwidge Thomas, shared her personal experiences with hot flashes and night sweats, as well as weight management and brain fog, as a healthcare provider and as a member of the BIPOC community dealing with menopause. With regards to brain fog, one study reported that approximately 60% of midlife women report problems with memory during the menopause transition. Yet these specific studies during the transition are rare.
So I have to say that that wasn't a typical problem for me, the night sweats. But, very recently, so, I started my menopause in early 50s, but about a year or so ago, while we were making some changes with my medication, I had this experience of an intense night sweat that rendered me completely drenched. My sheets were drenched, and it was just awful. And as I think back, I realized both my doctor and I both realized it was because of this medication change. But for the most part, that hasn't been my experience with having sort of these night sweats that really disrupts my sleep. I would say my top 5 symptoms, hot sweats definitely was the lead. Secondarily, definitely with the word finding difficulties, which that one really struck me because it was a time in my life where I had just been hired in this executive position, had to do a lot of presentations. And, doing these presentations, I'm in the moment, or doing these meetings, I'm in the moment, and I'm finding myself struggling with finding words. And I remember sort of panicking to a point where it almost even developed a little bit of an anxiety. And I remember talking to my doctor about it and realizing that that's all part of the symptoms. The other was the weight gain, and not necessarily gain, but the distribution of weight. And, you hear and you read, like the evidence even tells you that a lot of the weight gain is around the midsection. So I find that, what I used to do years ago didn't seem to work as well. I mean, I used to, I love running and I still run. But now I needed to do, sit-ups and all sorts of other calisthenics to be able to get myself back to where I used to be. And still, I'm not able to. So I would say definitely that weight distribution is definitely a problem. And I'd say I wouldn't call it necessarily fatigue, but definitely the energy level is not the same. I mean, I used to be able to, again, run, more miles during the week than I could now. And I'm literally sort of working myself up to getting to, the 10 to 12 miles that I typically enjoy. And that's been, just much more difficult. I would want to say one thing further, though, is that I do think that, unfortunately, because menopause is such a taboo conversation, overall women are not having these conversations and are sort of silent about it. More specifically, I think that Black women, and we've been socialized not to complain. And, I think our entire sort of society sees Black women as being extremely strong and can tolerate pain. And then there's all sorts of evidence that talks about how not just Black women, but Black men, in terms of how the lack of pain meds that are given because our pain tolerance is very high. And I just want to say that, menopause is such an awful experience, regardless of your Black, white, or whatever ethnicity you are, that I encourage, as much as I possibly can, women of color, Black women, to really talk about some of those symptoms that you're having, especially around depression and anxiety and the brain fog. It's not just the the hot flashes, because there's definitely support out there. There's definitely treatment out there. The weight issue is another big one I think that Black women always have suffered with. And, this is a time in a woman's life where, we could really focus on providing you some dedicated care to get you the care and the treatments that you deserve. And I urge you to speak to your clinician, speak to your doctor, and find doctors that you can talk to.
We've spent this segment learning from our experts and guests about the roles that race and ethnicity have on menopausal symptoms and the severity and length of time women experience these symptoms. In the following segments of this series, we'll examine additional barriers to care, misinformation and stigmas, as well as treatments and therapies, all pertaining to menopause. When it comes to understanding this transition in a woman's life, our goal is to help our audience have a better understanding of what menopause is and how it can help women make better choices when it comes to their management of their symptoms and overall physical and behavioral health throughout this stage in their lives. Please join us again for our next segment in this series, and we'll see you soon.